So I mentioned the 2016 data, but let's also think about what happened more recently in terms of fraud in 2017 and the reports to the Internet Crime Complaint Center. This is data specifically from their annual report. And what you'll see is a couple of important trends. Look at the difference from just 2013 to 2017 and the changes in cyber fraud reports to the FBI. It's grown quite a bit. Now, it's leveled off in 2016 and 17, but since 2000, more than 4 million people have notified the FBI that they were a victim of some type of internet crime or cyber fraud. In 2017, it was $1.4 billion in loss, and they received, it's a pretty busy phone number. They received each day 800 complaints. Age group here seems to target, at least people that are reporting, tend to be older. They're older. They lose more money, the older group, and it's not surprising that younger people aren't targeted as much because part of it would be that they're more savvy technologically, but also part of it is they just don't have the resources. So why would we target younger people if offenders are targeting certain groups? There's also been the FBI reports on which countries are victims, excluding the U.S., of these offenses, and you could, this report is online, you can take a look at that on your own. But what I wanted to peek at real quick is this overview of the states by number of victims, and you will see that there are patterns and that there are certain states that we see these reports more often. In fact, you note that California has the highest rate of reports, followed by Texas and Florida. And what would be fascinating, and you have the ability to do this, is to dive in and see how these actually relate to the job openings in these different states. And if you went to cyberseek.org, you would see that, in fact, the states that have the most victims, probably California, Texas, Florida, Virginia is up there in the top 10. But in fact, while it's in the top 10, it's toward the bottom of the top 10. It is the state with the second highest number of job openings in cybersecurity, and that's because of Northern Virginia here up in the D.C. area with the federal government there. We see those patterns. Now, the victim losses differences you see here, and the victim losses differences in terms of the amount. You see California and Texas holding in the lead there, along with Florida. But then you see some other states that weren't in the top 10 number of victims and are, in fact, in the top 10 dollar losses. So it suggests that when these offenses happen in those states, there's some considerable amounts that victims are losing. Now, the report also dives into the crime types that we see in these cyber frauds, and what's happening the most is the non-payment and non-delivery. What, in fact, twice as often is the next most popular, which would be the breaches and the phishing and the overpayments and the identity thefts and so on. So you can unpack and dive more deeply in if you're interested. And they also break down how much money is being lost to the different types, and you can see that there are patterns there as well. So the next question becomes who's committing these frauds, and most scams, they are in groups. It's just recognize that they tend to be done in groups. They tend to not large groups, but frequently a couple of folks involved, especially with the entrepreneurial types of offenses. The Nigerian advanced fee frauds, as I mentioned, they're called 419 frauds in reference to Nigeria's legal code that regulates against fraud. They can come from anywhere. obviously, what we call these Nigerian frauds, but many of them do come from Nigeria, and essentially what these ones entail, again, the advance fee fraud is if you give us money, we're going to give you something, and more money or access or whatever it may be. The idea that the fee is required in advance is what's captured within this concept of the Nigerian advanced fee fraud. There's a song about 419 that you may be familiar with. I'm not going to try and sing it, but it just depicts the fact that these notions of fraud and of 419 fraud are in fact out there in the popular media, and that it is something that is well recognized. And the fascinating part is, while it's so well recognized, one can't help but ask how it continues. If so many of us know that these are frauds, why do they happen? Before we talk about why they happen, there are signs of scams and email scams. The commonly cited signs that are cited are that they're poorly written. They have misspelled words in them, that there's a claim of you're going to get some money, just like I got $12.5 million. Those claims are obviously fraudulent. The email just shows up out of nowhere, and there's no prior history or contact with that individual. There's claims of legitimacy that they'll say they're working for the government or they're working for someone that makes it look legitimate. They'll say that they're from the Social Security agency when there is no such agency. It's the Social Security Administration. There's also claims of urgency. If you don't do this right away, then something bad's going to happen and you won't have access to those funds. So those are the common types of scams. Now, I would encourage you to write one. Write a scam letter just to get a sense of what's going on in that person's mind and what do they do, and that might help you conceive of how people do this. Now, don't send it. Do not send it. But these are the things that you'll see in those letters. Why do people do it? There's a couple of different criminological theories that we can point to here. One of them being our popular routine activities theory. Now, routine activities theory, I've alluded to it before. This is a theory put forth by Cohen and Felsen back in 1979. They wrote an article for the American Sociological Review. In this article, what they looked at is why did burglaries increase in the 1960s? And they looked at what made burglaries increase in the 60s. And they came to the conclusion that there were three things that happened in the 60s that increased burglaries at that time. One thing they said that happened in the 60s is women entered the workforce at a much higher rate than they ever had before. Now, what that did is when they entered the workforce, the homes were left empty and vacant during the daytime, when prior to that time, there was always someone home. So more homes became vacant. Guardians were not present in those homes. Also, we had more 18 to 24-year-olds. And 18 to 24-year-olds are notoriously that age group that engages in the most types, that has the highest rate of offending. So we had more offenders present. Also, Cohen and Felsen pointed out we had more televisions. Televisions were new, brand new at the time. Plopped them in our houses, suddenly there was something to steal. So we had empty houses, we had more 18 to 24-year-olds, and we had something worth stealing, vulnerable targets. So the absence of a capable guardian, the presence of a motivated offender, vulnerable targets, increase the likelihood of crime. Now let's take that and apply it to fraud. The internet has increased the number of motivated offenders and vulnerable targets, and it is really hard to protect cyberspace or to guard in cyberspace. Certainly there are things that can be done, but Again, we went from having just the 18 and 24-year-olds in a particular area as potential offenders to the whole world being potential offenders in cyberspace. And we went to being vulnerable just in our own specific space to being vulnerable across cyberspace. That increase in vulnerability and that increase in the number of offenders in a space that's very hard to guard results in fraud being incredibly easy to commit. As we said, any of us could do it if we wanted to. If we don't want to, but it's not difficult. So routine activities theory looks at how these intersections between guardianship, motivation, and vulnerability come together. Now, self-control theory, we've alluded to this one before, and this one's also been popular in explaining fraud. And what this one points to is that the idea that people are impulsive and short-sighted and not able to control their desires to do things. And there are studies that show that cyber fraud victims, now we're looking at victims here, not offenders, but victims might actually have low levels of self-control, suggesting that they might be more impulsive than non-victims. And this would be an example of someone sees something on the internet for sale and they just can't stop themselves from buying it, even though they wonder is it something that's legit. They really, really want that, so they go forward with the purchase. That's part of the reason why people don't report these offenses, because they feel, I shouldn't have done it. I knew better, and I did it, but I should have known better. But it's that level of self-control in victims that potentially makes them more vulnerable. So it's a higher vulnerability target in this sense that increases the likelihood that victimization will occur in cyber frauds. And you could apply those principles all the way across all of our types of cyber fraud, from extortion to internet crimes, to internet auction frauds, to non-delivery, and those sorts of things. That people just want something that's too good to be true, probably is too good, yet we sometimes follow through on those. How do other disciplines view cyber fraud? Information technologists would look at this through a lens that wonders about how information is shared in cyberspace, and how that sharing of information invites individuals to do things that would be criminal. Businesses would be concerned about how we can protect our businesses from being scammed and being ripped off, and how we can create ethical business people who aren't going to engage in entrepreneurial types of offending. Philosophers would be interested in exploring how ethical belief systems promote or limit the existence of fraud in different areas, and engineers might be interested in how we could build solutions that would maybe weed out in the cyber physical system opportunities for fraud. Computer scientists might be interested in how behaviors and the intersection of human behavior and computers might perpetrate crime, and criminal justice folks might be interested in how we develop a criminal justice policy and criminal justice practices that truly help people protect themselves against cyber frauds. Now, criminal justice professionals they're the ones we're going to call if we want a response. We want our money back. We call the police. Now, local police aren't going to respond to this. Federal investigators will investigate. It's unlikely we're going to get our money back. These offenses are so difficult to investigate, but so easy to commit. But still, it's that criminal justice system we'll see when we talk about the criminal justice response to cybercrime in general that actually gets involved. As with the other types of offenses, the best way to understand cyber fraud is to pull together perspectives and frameworks from each of these disciplines to give us an interdisciplinary lens to understand cyberfault.